Most people don't know that one of Britain's most decorated spies spent 4 years convincing everyone he knew that he was a Nazi traitor. But the reason he survived isn't what you've been told. The truth is way more complicated and way darker than the propaganda suggests. When you hear about double agents in World War II, you probably think of James Bond or fictional spy thrillers. Those are the famous stories. Those are the ones everyone imagines. But there's another story that almost nobody knows. A story about a British criminal who became a German spy who became a British hero. A story about a man whose own wife thought he was a traitor for 30 years. A story about deception so deep that even the people closest to him couldn't know the truth. So, who was he? Why did he do it? And how did he fool the Nazis for years while saving London from destruction? Let's talk about the truth that both sides tried to hide. His name was Eddie Chapman, and before the war, he was a criminal. Not a resistance fighter, not a patriot, not a military hero. He was a safecracker, a burglar, a con man. He was wanted by the police. He was running from the law. He was exactly the kind of person the British government would never trust. But circumstances changed everything. Eddie was born in 1914 in County Durham, England. He grew up poor. He grew up rough. He didn't have opportunities. He didn't have education. What he had was cunning and charm and absolutely no respect for the law. By his 20s, Eddie was a professional criminal. He specialized in breaking into safes. He was good at it. Really good at it. He made money. He lived well. He had fancy clothes and fast cars and beautiful women. But he was also constantly being chased by the police. In 1939, Eddie was hiding out in Jersey. Jersey is one of the Channel Islands between England and France. It was part of Britain, but it was isolated. It was far from London. Eddie thought he'd be safe there. He thought the police wouldn't find him. He was wrong about many things, but he was right about one thing. The police didn't find him. The Nazis did. When Germany invaded France in 1940, they also took over the Channel Islands. The islands were the only part of Britain that the Nazis actually occupied during the war. Eddie was trapped. He was stuck on an island controlled by German soldiers. He was a British criminal on Nazi-occupied territory, and he made a decision that would change his entire life. He decided to offer his services to the Germans. This wasn't patriotism. This wasn't ideology. Eddie didn't care about politics. He didn't believe in Nazi philosophy. He didn't hate Britain. What he cared about was survival, and he saw an opportunity. The Germans were recruiting agents. They needed people who could operate in Britain. They needed people who knew the country, who spoke the language, who could blend in. Eddie spoke fluent English, obviously. He was British. He knew London. He knew how to break into buildings. He knew how to forge documents. He knew how to lie convincingly. From the German perspective, he was perfect. Eddie approached the German intelligence service, the Abwehr. He told them he wanted to work for Germany. He told them he hated the British government because they'd imprisoned him. He told them he was motivated by revenge. He told them he wanted money. And the Germans believed him. Why wouldn't they? Eddie was a criminal. Criminals were motivated by self-interest. It made sense. It was logical. They recruited him. The Germans gave Eddie a code name. They called him Fritz. They sent him to occupied France for training. This is where Eddie's story gets really interesting because the training he received wasn't basic spy work. It was advanced sabotage. The Germans taught him how to use explosives. They taught him how to build bombs. They taught him how to destroy infrastructure. They taught him radio operation, secret codes, invisible ink, all the classic spy tradecraft. They were preparing him for a mission in Britain. A mission to blow things up. By 1942, Eddie had completed his training. The Germans trusted him. They believed he was loyal to Germany. They believed he hated Britain. They gave him his mission. He was supposed to parachute into England, make contact with the criminal underworld, and carry out sabotage operations against British industrial targets. Specifically, he was supposed to destroy the de Havilland aircraft factory. This factory was producing mosquito bombers, which were causing serious problems for the German war effort. If Eddie could destroy the factory, it would be a major victory for Germany. So the Germans put Eddie on a plane. They gave him money, explosives, fake identification papers, a radio transmitter, and they dropped him over England. Eddie parachuted into Cambridgeshire in December 1942. He landed in a field. He buried his parachute. He gathered his equipment. And then he did something the Germans never expected. He turned himself into the British. Eddie walked into a police station and he told them everything. He told them he was a German agent. He told them about his training. He told them about his mission. He told them about the codes, the radio, the explosives, and most importantly, he told them he wanted to work for Britain. He wanted to become a double agent. The British intelligence service, MI5, was skeptical, very skeptical. Here was a known criminal, a man with a long police record, claiming to be a German spy who now wanted to help Britain. It sounded insane. It sounded like a trap. It sounded like exactly the kind of lie a German plant would tell. But MI5 decided to investigate. They interrogated Eddie for weeks. They checked his story. They verified details. They tested him. And slowly, they started to believe him. MI5 realized that Eddie was telling the truth. He really was a German agent. And more importantly, they realized that Eddie could be incredibly valuable. If they could control Eddie, if they could feed false information back to Germany through him, they could manipulate German intelligence. They could waste German resources. They could protect British targets. So MI5 made a decision. They would run Eddie as a double agent. They gave him a new code name. They called him Zigzag, because his loyalties zigzagged, because his path through the war was unpredictable, because he was unreliable and brilliant and dangerous all at the same time. Now Eddie had to convince the Germans that he was completing his mission. He had to convince them that he was destroying British targets. He had to convince them that he was loyal to Germany while actually working for Britain. This required incredible deception. This required elaborate staging. MI5 helped Eddie fake the destruction of the de Havilland factory. They didn't actually blow it up. Obviously, that would defeat the entire purpose. Instead, they created the illusion of destruction. They built fake wreckage. They moved real wreckage from other bomb sites to make it look like the factory had been hit. They painted scorch marks on buildings. They took aerial photographs that showed apparent devastation. And then they had Eddie radio back to Germany claiming success. The Germans believed it. They looked at the reconnaissance photos. They saw the damage. They thought Eddie had actually destroyed the factory. They were thrilled. They thought they had a brilliant agent operating in Britain. They sent Eddie messages congratulating him. They sent him more money. They sent him new missions. And Eddie kept feeding them false information. He kept telling them what MI5 wanted them to believe. But here's where Eddie's life became truly complicated. Eddie couldn't tell anyone what he was really doing. Not his friends, not his family, not even his wife. Eddie had a partner, a woman named Fred Stevenson. She knew Eddie before the war. She knew he was a criminal, but she didn't know he was a spy. She couldn't know. If the Germans suspected that Eddie had revealed his mission to anyone, they would know he'd been compromised. They would know he was working for the British. So Eddie had to lie to Fred. He had to let her believe that he was exactly what he appeared to be. A German collaborator, a traitor, a man who was working for the enemy. Fred was horrified. From her perspective, the man she loved had betrayed Britain. He was working for the Nazis. He was helping Germany. He was a traitor, and Eddie couldn't tell her the truth. He had to watch her anguish. He had to watch her disgust. He had to let her believe the worst about him. And he couldn't say anything because saying anything would compromise the mission, would put her in danger, would potentially get them both killed. This went on for years. Years of deception. Years of lying. Years of letting the people he cared about think he was a monster. MI5 sent Eddie back to Germany multiple times. They had him report to his German handlers in person. They had him maintain his cover. The Germans never suspected. They kept trusting him. They kept giving him missions. They kept believing he was their man in Britain. Eddie's most important work involved false intelligence about bombing targets. By 1944, Germany was launching V-1 flying bombs at London. These were unmanned missiles, early cruise missiles, and they were devastating. They would fly across the Channel and explode in London, killing civilians, destroying buildings. The Germans were using intelligence reports to adjust their aim, to make sure the bombs hit the most populated areas, the most important targets. Eddie gave them false reports. He told them the bombs were overshooting London. He told them they were landing north of the city. In reality, most of the V-1 bombs were landing in South London, in heavily populated areas. But because of Eddie's false intelligence, the Germans adjusted their aim. They started aiming shorter, and the bombs started landing in less populated areas, south of London, in the countryside, in places where fewer people would die. Eddie's false intelligence saved lives. Historians estimate that his misdirection prevented 8 major bombing raids on central London. 8 raids that would have killed thousands of people. 8 raids that would have destroyed critical infrastructure. 8 raids that never happened because the Germans believed Eddie's lies. The Germans never knew. They thought their agent Zigzag was giving them accurate intelligence. They thought he was helping them destroy London. In reality, he was protecting it. The deception continued until the end of the war. Eddie kept feeding false information to Germany. He kept maintaining his cover. He kept lying to everyone. And when the war finally ended in 1945, Eddie's work as a double agent was classified. Top secret. The British government couldn't reveal what he'd done because they wanted to protect their intelligence methods. They wanted to keep the Germans, and later the Soviets, from understanding exactly how British counterintelligence worked. So Eddie's heroism remained hidden. His sacrifice remained unknown. And Fred still thought he was a traitor. After the war, Eddie tried to live a normal life. He got married to Fred officially. They had a daughter. He tried various businesses, some legal, some not quite legal. Eddie never really stopped being a criminal at heart. He was too wild, too chaotic, too addicted to risk. But he carried a secret he couldn't share. A secret that ate at him. The secret that he'd actually been a hero. It wasn't until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended, that the British government finally declassified Eddie's wartime activities. 30 years. 3 decades. That's how long Eddie had to wait before he could tell the truth. That's how long Fred had to live thinking her husband had been a Nazi collaborator. When the truth finally came out, Fred learned what Eddie had really done. She learned about the double agent work. She learned about the lives he'd saved. She learned that the man she'd thought was a traitor had actually been protecting Britain all along. Fred's reaction isn't well documented in historical records. We don't know exactly what she said. We don't know exactly how she felt. But we can imagine. 30 years of believing your husband betrayed his country. 30 years of shame. 30 years of wondering how you could have loved a traitor. And then learning it was all a lie. Learning that he'd been a hero. Learning that he'd sacrificed his reputation, his relationships, his entire life to protect people. The emotional weight of that revelation must have been overwhelming. Eddie wrote a book about his experiences. It was called The Eddie Chapman Story. He gave interviews. He told his story. He tried to reclaim his reputation. But even after the declassification, many people didn't believe him. Many people thought he was still lying. Many people thought he was exaggerating. Many people thought a criminal couldn't possibly have been a hero. The stigma followed him for the rest of his life. Eddie died in 1997. He was 83 years old. He died in Hertfordshire. He died having finally told his story, but never fully escaping the shadow of the lies he told during the war. His obituaries called him many things: a spy, a criminal, a con man, a hero. All of those descriptions were accurate. Eddie was all of those things at once. Here's what makes Eddie Chapman's story remarkable. Here's what makes it different from other spy stories. Eddie wasn't motivated by patriotism, at least not at first. He was motivated by survival, by self-interest, by the same criminal instincts that had driven him his entire life. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Somewhere along the way, Eddie decided that protecting people mattered, that saving lives mattered, that being on the right side mattered, even if nobody would ever know it. Eddie Chapman was a criminal who became a hero. He was a man who lied for a living, who told the most important truth of his life. He was a man who let everyone he loved think the worst of him so he could protect them. He was a man who saved thousands of lives by convincing the enemy he was killing people. The real tragedy is how long Eddie had to carry that secret. 30 years of letting people believe he was a traitor. 30 years of watching his wife live with shame. 30 years of being unable to defend himself. That's a different kind of sacrifice. That's a different kind of courage. Eddie's story raises uncomfortable questions. It raises questions about loyalty, about who we trust, about how we judge people. It raises questions about patriotism, about whether criminals can be patriots, about whether someone with a criminal past can do heroic things. And it raises questions about secrecy, about the cost of keeping secrets, about what happens when you can't tell the truth even to the people you love. After the war, Eddie was asked why he did it, why he risked everything, why he betrayed the Germans, why he worked for Britain when he had no reason to be loyal. And according to historical records, he said something simple. He said that when he saw what the Nazis were really doing, when he understood what they represented, he knew he couldn't help them. He said that he might have been a criminal, but he wasn't a monster. He said that some lines you don't cross. Even if you've crossed every other line in your life. It's a simple answer. But it's also a profound answer because it suggests that Eddie, despite everything, despite his criminal past, despite his selfish motivations, had a moral core, had a line he wouldn't cross, had a limit to how far he'd go for money or survival. The real story of Eddie Chapman isn't a story of a perfect hero. It's not a story of someone who overcame great odds and defeated evil through noble virtue. It's a much messier story. It's a story of a flawed man who did the right thing for complicated reasons. It's a story of someone who used his skills, his criminal skills, to protect people. It's a story of someone who sacrificed his reputation so others could live. And that's why it matters. Because it shows that heroes don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be saints. They don't have to be soldiers or statesmen. Sometimes heroes are criminals. Sometimes heroes are liars. Sometimes heroes are people who make all the wrong choices until they finally make the right one. Eddie Chapman was one of those people, and his story deserves to be remembered. Not as a famous story, not as a celebrated story, but as a complicated story about a complicated man who did something extraordinary when it mattered most. If you want to see more videos about the real stories from World War II that go beyond the propaganda, hit subscribe. New videos every week.